Hey folks, in this video you're going to learn how to control things within Sunday Keys for Ableton from your MIDI hardware. We're going to talk about how you can map controls, whether they be drum pads, buttons, knobs, faders, or something else. Map your hardware so that it controls what you want it to control within Ableton. Now Ableton's made this pretty simple to do, but first, before we talk about it, we have to make sure that we go to Ableton Live Preferences. So on Windows, it's under Edit. And we just want to go to the Link and MIDI tab and make sure that any hardware that you want to learn in MIDI map mode has remote turned on. So I've got my MIDI keyboard here, the key station set. I only want it to control tracks. I only want it to send MIDI and actually play those notes, play the sustain. So I've got track turned on, but remote turned off. And then I have my Nano Control 2 with remote turned on, but I don't want it to send any data to the tracks to generate any audio. So all you would need to do for this tutorial to make sense for you is go to the MIDI tab of Preferences and make sure whatever hardware you're trying to do MIDI learn with has remote turned on. It's pretty easy to do a MIDI learn in Ableton and in Sunday Keys for Ableton. To do this, you're going to click the MIDI button up here at the top right corner of your screen. And now you'll see everything on screen that you can map. Sort of turn purplish in Ableton 10, might be a slightly different color in Ableton 9. But this lets you know everything that you can automate, everything that you can map to your MIDI hardware. So to map something, it's as simple as selecting the control and then moving your physical hardware. So I've already got most of the controls on the Nano Control 2 here already set up. But I'm going to go here and hit the drop down there. And this allows me to see all the MIDI mappings that have already been made. Now I'm going to go ahead and just delete this one. This is the track volume for Pianos 1. And I just highlighted it and hit delete on my keyboard, just so that I can demonstrate what MIDI mapping looks like. So now I'm going to grab this fader right here. And then I'm going to move the physical fader that I want to map it to. So I'm moving fader 1 on my Nano Control 2. And as soon as you see those little numbers appear next to an item, you'll know that it's been mapped to something. So now to view the details of the mapping, just hit this drop down over here. And you can see this is the mapping that we just created. So it's controlling Pianos 1, mixer, track volume. And this is where you can set the minimum and maximum value for any of these mappings. For making volume mappings and things like that, you might not want to be able to go the full range of the sweep. For volume mappings, I like to have it set to 0 decibels. You could also set the minimum value. So if you didn't want to be able to turn something all the way off, if you just wanted to be able to make it quieter, then you could set the minimum value to something like -20 decibels or something like that. Now, volume mappings aren't the only kinds of mappings that you can make. You can also see that when you select a track, you can also map anything that's down here in the instrument view. So you've got the global effects for Pianos 1, you've got the chain selector for Pianos 1, and then you have the rack for the selected instrument. Now, I talked about this in the last video a little bit. I don't recommend making mappings to the racks here because you're going to run out of space on your hardware really quickly, because as soon as you select another instrument, right, then there's all sorts of other controls, and they're not going to carry over. You can't just assign to space 1. It's actually going to assign to that specific control in that specific rack. So I like to map things to the global effects. So this is a good opportunity to talk about the filters and the mappings that are the default in Sunday Keys for Ableton and how it relates to the Nano Control 2. So track 1 has a mapping to the low-pass filter that goes to knob 1 on the Nano. And the same for piano 2, that's knob 2. Pads 1 is knob 3. Pads 2, 4, all the way down. And the exception to this is the last track here, auxiliary 2. You can see a note here that says LPF not mapped. Now there's a reason for this, and this is sort of specific to folks who are using the Nano Control 2. The last knob on your Nano Control 2, the top right knob, is not controlling the auxiliary 2 low-pass filter. Instead, It controls a global filter, which you can see in this track right here that says FILTE. This is the filter track. Now, what this allows you to do is, at any given moment, just by moving this one knob, I'm moving knob 8 on my Nano Control 2 right now, able to increase or decrease the high end with a single knob. And this is going to affect all of the pads, the synths, and the auxiliary sounds. The only thing that it won't affect is pianos 1, pianos 2, and the tonic section. This is a really nice dynamic control. Sounds really great. I'm playing in G while I have an A drone going. I'll stop that there. So by default, this is mapped to knob 8 on the Nano Control 2. Now, if you have another MIDI controller that you're planning to use, then this is a great idea for you to MIDI map to this filter. And so I'll show you where it is. I'm going to click on the filter channel strip right here. And when you do, you'll see this EQ8 plugin right there. Now, I'm going to click on the MIDI button. And you're going to want to select this frequency control right here. When you do, you'll be able to control this. So you can see that as I move the knob on my Nano Control 2, and as you move the knob on your fader, it's going to sweep this range right here. Now, it's really important that you set the minimum and maximum values for this specific mapping. Go to MIDI again. I'm going to select that, because you don't necessarily want to be able to sweep all the way down here, because then you're not going to hear anything at all, right? So I like to set the shade value to be about 800 hertz. That's what I found sounds pretty musical. You can tweak that if you'd like, but the idea here is just that it's really helpful to have sort of a global tone control. Now, by default, I said it doesn't affect the pianos or tonic. And this, let me show you how this is set up really quickly. We're going to hit this I/O button that shows us the ins and outs or hides them for each track. You can see we've got the MIDI stuff at the top. We don't need to worry about that. All we need to worry about here is the Audio 2 section. So any track that you want to be controlled by this filter, set the Audio 2 to be filter. And then any track that you don't want to filter, set the Audio track to master. And when you do that, then these tracks will be affected by the filter and the other tracks will not be. This is really helpful for you to still have a nice piano sound coming through that sounds natural, but be able to aggressively filter down your synths and your pad sounds without having to worry about your piano being affected. So that's how this global filter works. You can send anything through it that you would like, and you can map any control that you would like to it by just selecting the filter channel strip and then mapping to this frequency control, and then just be sure to set a useful minimum value for that mapping. Now, we're going to talk about a couple other things here in mappings before we move on. I'm going to go back to MIDI. You can see that you can also MIDI map any clip. So in the Nano Control 2, I've set the first tracks. There's 3 buttons on the Nano Control 2 in each section. These buttons fire clip 1, clip 2, and clip 3 in pianos 1. And the same all the way across. And this is really handy to be able to have hands-on control, be able to just pull up a clip. Just think of it as a favorite button, right? You're able to just push the one button and get the sound that you want. And then I also like to map a button to the off for each track so that I can shut that off if I would like. But there's no rules to how you can set this up. You can map to drum pads on your MIDI controller or buttons, whatever makes the most sense for you. So there's one other cool way to pull up something or automatically affect something in Ableton. It's called key mapping. I'm going to depress the MIDI button here, and I'm going to hit the key button. Now this is cool because it allows you to actually set a key on your keyboard to pull up anything that you would like or to adjust anything that you would like. So for example, I could set, I'll go down here and I'll say that I want to be able to pull up the hazy piano at the touch of a button. So I'm going to select the hazy piano, and I'm going to hit the Z key on my keyboard. And you can see a little Z appears right there. And then I'm going to hit the key button again. Now, anytime I hit the Z button on my keyboard, it's going to jump to that clip. So if you don't have a MIDI controller like the Nano Control 2 or anything at all, you could actually use the rows of the keys on your keyboard to pull up your favorite clips and be able to mix and match presets in that way, which is a pretty doggone cool way to do it. You can also key map or MIDI map to the master scenes over here. So if you want to pull up a favorite preset, a row of presets, or your songs, you can, for example, key map your songs for a given performance to be 1, 2, and 3 on your keyboard. And then no matter where you're at in your performance, you'll be able to fire that whole scene just by hitting those numbered keys on your keyboard. And you can MIDI map in the exact same way to buttons that you had on your MIDI controller. So it's a really cool way to be able to interact with things. Ableton makes it really easy to do so. If you ever want to view the mappings that you made, just hit the key or the MIDI button and hit the drop down over here, and you can view all of the mappings you made. You can select one and hit the delete or backspace key on your keyboard to delete it. I'm going to do the same for MIDI here. I don't think I've got any left over. Now we're back to where we started. All right, so one other thing I want to talk about is using your mod wheel or controls on your MIDI controller itself. Just something to keep an eye out for. Ableton doesn't differentiate between different MIDI controllers sending in MIDI data. So if you have a control on your MIDI controller that sends channel 1 and MIDI CC7, and then you have something on your MIDI controller like the Nano Control 2 that's also sending MIDI channel 1, CC7, Ableton's going to see them as the same thing when it comes time to MIDI map. So you can see these mappings, they have a MIDI channel, which is 1, and then a CC number. They don't actually belong to any specific controller. So the problem that you might run into is something like if you have, I'll show you. We'll go to Preferences here, and I'm going to turn on Remote for my MIDI keyboard. So I'm going to turn on Remote there. Now that I've turned on Remote, Ableton is going to be listening, and I'm going to be able to MIDI map stuff on my keyboard itself, on the key station, to stuff within Ableton. But here's the problem. I've got this button on my Nano Control 2. It's the R button on the first section of the Nano. And I've MIDI mapped it to this off button, which happens to send on my Nano Control, it sends on channel 1 MIDI CC64. Now, since I've turned Remote on for my MIDI keyboard, the sustain pedal is actually sending on channel 1 MIDI CC64 as well. So anytime I hit my sustain pedal, it's going to jump to this clip, which is not ideal. So yes, the button on my Nano Control works. I'm pushing my Nano Control right now, and it's working exactly how I would expect. But if, no matter what clip I'm on here, anytime I hit my sustain pedal on my keyboard, it's just going to jump back to this off clip because it's the exact same MIDI data that Ableton is receiving, and it doesn't allow you to designate a specific source for a specific mapping. Now, the way that you can set specific sources is in Preferences with this remote function. But the problem is that it's global. So if I wanted to be able to use my mod wheel to, for example, map to that global filter we talked about a minute ago, it's also going to let my sustain pedal pass through and also affect any other mappings that I've made. So the solution here is to actually change the way your MIDI hardware works, right? So make sure that your MIDI keyboard is sending on a different MIDI channel than the rest of your hardware. Ableton sort of expects you to do those kinds of things rather than giving you the ability to filter those things out within the program. So it's really easy to, on most hardware, it's easy to change the MIDI channel that your hardware sends on. So whether it's the Nano Control 2 or your MIDI keyboard, you would just change it so it's sending on a different MIDI channel. It doesn't even need to be a different CC number, which is the second number here. But the MIDI channel just needs to be different so that Ableton differentiates between the two. So this is only really a problem for folks who really want to use controls on their own hardware. You can see, since I've got remote turned on right now, fader 2 here, track 2's fader volume is being controlled. I'm moving the mod wheel on my keyboard right now, which just happens to send the same data as fader 2 on my Nano Control 2. So I'm touching my Nano Control 2 now, and it's working as I wanted to. Now I'm moving my mod wheel, and it's doing the exact same thing. So the solution would be to change my keyboard to send on MIDI channel 2 or on a different MIDI CC, but it's really a good idea in Ableton to have each piece of your hardware rig send on a different MIDI channel so that everything is nice and clean coming into Ableton. So if you need to know how to do that, it's going to vary depending on your MIDI hardware. So I would recommend that you check out the user manual for the MIDI hardware that you have to find out how to do that. Okay, so we've talked about MIDI mapping, and we've talked about how to view those mappings and make any changes to them that you feel the need. Talked about how to set a minimum and maximum value for those that have a range of controls instead of just being on or off. And we also talked about how you can key map, how you can set anything that you'd like to be controlled by a key on your keyboard. You can use them to fire your favorite presets, which is a great way to do so. And then we also talked about how you can delete any MIDI mapping by just selecting it and hitting delete on your keyboard. Then the last thing we talked about is how Ableton can sometimes have a hard time when you're sending different controllers on the same MIDI channels and they're sending the same data. Ableton doesn't differentiate between the two, and that can cause some problems. So the simple solution is just to designate that each of your control surfaces sends on a different MIDI channel, and then you can MIDI map however you would like. Now, before we wrap up this video, I just want to talk about the Nano Control 2 specifically for just a quick second, and I want to talk about a preference setting that can make any MIDI hardware a lot more useful and musical for live performance. Just because you can jump around from all the way off to all the way up in Ableton doesn't mean that your hardware is going to follow those changes. So there's a preference setting that you can use that will make those transitions smoother. If you don't use this setting, then sometimes when you move a fader, when Ableton is programmed to be all the way down for this fader, and if I move this fader on my hardware a little bit, it's going to jump up like that, and that might not always be what you're going for. It might not be a smooth transition. So in order to set this to be a little bit more musical, there's a preference setting that I like to go change. You're going to go to Live Preferences, and it's right here under MIDI above MIDI ports. It's this takeover mode, and you've got a few options here. By default, it's set to none, and then you have the option to pick up, which means that Ableton is going to wait until you get to the actual range that that your MIDI hardware is at, and then it's going to start to listen. So what that might look like here is that it's not going to do anything. You see down here it says at the bottom, track volume is awaiting pickup. It's not going to start responding until I go to where it is. So when I go all the way down on my hardware, then I can start to control it. But until then, I don't have any control at all. I don't like this setting because you have to search for the setting it's listening for before you actually have control. So the way that I like to set this up is with value scaling. Value scaling simply means that it's going to split the difference. It's going to do some fancy math between where it's set to in Ableton and where your hardware is. So how this is going to work, let's say that I have my volume about halfway. I'll go halfway here. And on my Nano Control 2 right now, the volume is all the way up. So this fader is pushed all the way up. But in Ableton, the volume's halfway. Well, how this is going to work in Ableton, it's going to do some math. As I start to bring my fader down, it's going to split the difference and proportionally move the track volume down. And this is true as I go up as well. So it's a nice, smooth transition there with my fader instead of a really jumpy one. This is a really great setting for folks who do like to fade things in and out and really want to focus on creating really smooth transitions. So I recommend that you try out that value scaling setting under pickup mode. Now, last thing, we're going to talk about the Nano Control 2 really quickly. So like I've already talked about, All of the solo, mute, and record buttons in each of the 8 main sections of the Nano Control 2, they are by default MIDI mapped to the favorites row 1, 2, and these all off buttons. So if you were to copy and paste a different clip up here, it would still work. But if you were to add a different row in between, then the mapping would move to that new row. So you can always remap these, and you could do anything you wanted with these buttons, but this is where they're at by default. And then each of the faders of the Nano Control 2 correspond to the 8 main tracks in Ableton's fader volume. And the knobs, like I've already touched on a little bit, they all control the low-pass filter, which is global for each track. So the low-pass filter for Pianos 1 is going to affect every track or every preset in this track. It's not going to affect anything else in the template, but it's going to affect all of the piano presets, no matter which one I load up. And the same is true for each of these tracks, with the exception, as noted earlier, being Auxiliary 2, which doesn't have a default mapping for the low-pass filter, and that's just to make room for the global filter to be on that 8th knob. Now, if you decide to map the global filter to something else, like an expression pedal or a control on your MIDI keyboard, on your MIDI hardware, you could definitely go ahead and map this low-pass filter to that 8th knob on the Nano Control so that it was nice and consistent, but that's up to you. Now, over on the left side of the Nano Control 2, there are a few other buttons that have been pre-mapped, and I'll talk about them really quickly. The top 2 arrow buttons in the middle left of the screen, if you have the skin, they're the previous and next buttons. These 2 buttons jump up or down in the master scenes. So as I'm pressing the next button on my Nano, it's jumping down a scene. As I push the previous button, it's going up. This is a great way to go about it if you tend to use a preset or a scene per song. Then you can just move to the next scene when you're ready to start the next song. Now, one thing to note, you can queue up the next scene using the previous and next buttons, and then you have to press the set button, which is just to the right of that on the Nano Control 2, to actually fire the next scene. This is great because you can play a scene, scroll down and be ready to go to the next one, and then when you're ready, you just hit the set button and it's going to fire the next scene. And then Ableton's automatically going to jump down to the next scene over in your master scenes, so you're ready to go. So in theory, if you've got your songs laid out in scenes, just in order, you could just hit that set button over and over, and it would just automatically go to the next patch. And you can always go back up to previous scenes if you'd like, and fire those as well. Below the previous and next buttons, there's the cycle button, and if you have the Nano Control 2 skin, it's labeled Panic. In Sunday Keys for Ableton, what this does is stop Ableton's timeline. So when I press that, it presses this square stop button here. And what this does is it freezes all MIDI. So if your MIDI data is coming in, if it's frozen, if things aren't going well, if you're having issues with CPU usage, or if your notes are stuck, you can press that cycle button, and it's going to function as a panic button, which is going to stop MIDI incoming and then reset. And then if you press the cycle button again, the panic button, it's going to set the timeline back to 111. So the very beginning of your timeline here in arrangement view. All of your clips will stay the same. Whichever clips are selected, whichever presets are selected will still be playable when you hit that cycle, that panic button. But it just stops all MIDI for a millisecond, so that if you do have a stuck note or if things aren't working out well, sometimes hitting that cycle panic button can really help get things working again. And then the last thing that's pre-mapped on the Nano Control 2 is tap tempo, and that is the record button. It's the little dot button towards the bottom. It's the 5th button from the left on the Nano Control 2, and if you have the skin, it's labeled tap. So this is just an easy way for you to tap in the tempo. So whatever you tap in, Ableton will take the average of it and set that as the tempo. So that's a little bit about how the Nano Control 2 is pre-mapped to work with Sunday Keys for Ableton. Now these are just how we've set it up. You can obviously use the Nano Control 2 in other ways as well. You're just limited by your creativity and the way that you think is going to make the most sense for you as a musician. All right, in the next video, we're going to talk about how you can adjust the note range of an instrument. This is really useful when you're building layered patches, because you might not necessarily want synth bass all the way up in your right hand, and it'd be great to be able to play a lead line in your right hand and play a bass part in your left hand at the same time. So I'm going to show you how to do that in the next video. We'll see you there.